Okay, thank you very much for coming back. We have 3 presentations, and I can tell you it's going to be exciting. We have underwater, we have mid-air, and we also have Stroop tests. And we start with Stroop tests. Our colleague, Stefan Gradl, comes from Germany, and he's going to present for about 25 minutes. He promised he will leave some time for questions and answers at the end. Over to you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Stroop room, which is kind of a stressor application in virtual reality. It is not as exciting as the stuff that Mark just presented, so I hope you bear with me. So what are we doing? We created that Stroop room as a way to do mass experiments on a lot of subjects to assess the stress level and their stress reactivity. And when I talk mass, I talk about like 5,000, 10,000 people. So that's not possible to do with classical laboratory tests. That's why we created this. A short motivation for this. So stress is a kind of big problem nowadays. A lot of people are really stressed. If you experience a lot of stress for a long period of time, you might get like a disease from it. There's an ICD-10 coding tree, an entire coding tree just for stress-related diseases nowadays. And the costs, they are really projected to be very high. So in 2020, there was an estimation that the costs for stress-related, or the stress-related costs, that means all the costs that the companies have for the workers not working, not being able to work because of stress problems, and all the healthcare costs, that they will reach about 1 trillion US dollars or euro in Europe. And so we are doing a research project right now where we try to assess the situation kind of in the workforce. And now what we want to do is we want to, for example, assess the stress reactivity of the people. And the stress reactivity is something that is different for each and every person. And you can see a graph here of a 2-day test. So the TSST, the Trier Social Stress Test, was applied to people on 2 subsequent days. And as you can see in the curves, so normally you would expect a person to habituate to a stressor. So if you experience a stressor and the same stressor the next day, then you are not that freaked out anymore. But of course there are differences, and there are people who do not habituate, and they get freaked out every day exactly the same. So you can imagine that this is bad. If you cannot habituate to a stressor for a long period of time, you will be more likely to get a disease, a stress-related disease. Now, that is basically what we're going to do, and what we do is on a large study population. So the research goal for our work was to create a valuable laboratory-like stressor that is usable in the wild and with high repeatability, and one that people don't hate to use. So hate to use, I mean, if you look at the existing versions, the existing laboratory stressors, we have 3 different kind of stressors. We have physical stressors, for example, the cold pressor test, where people are required to hold their hand into ice cold water for 1 minute. And you can imagine this is quite painful, and your body shows a severe stress reaction. And then there are other kinds of stress tests, for example, the social stressors, the TSST, like I mentioned, and the MIST, the Montreal Imaging Stress Test. Those are tests that kind of try to create a social shame. So you have to give a speech, for example, about your weaknesses in front of a committee, and you have to do math, pretty complicated math in front of the committee, and it is created in a way that you cannot succeed. So at some point you will fail, and that creates some kind of shameful feeling, and that is what's creating stress, the most stress actually. So the TSST is kind of the gold standard stressor in science. And then we have the cognitive stressors. So the cognitive stressors, they don't have those disadvantages of being hurtful or inducing social shame. So you just do math, for example. Or you do the Stroop test, and we hope to also add the Stroop room eventually to this list. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Stroop test is, so the Stroop effect, it's that test where you have a color word written in a different color or painted in a different color. And this is the incongruent condition. There's also a congruent one where it's all the same, kind of the baseline condition. And in the incongruent condition, you're supposed to name the color. So you're presented with a word, and you have to name the color and not read the word. And that's difficult for us because we are so good at reading then that we intuitively want to read the word and not name the color. And we have to inhibit that executive function and focus on the color and name the color, and that's kind of the Stroop effect. You can see it in the graph. If you have that incongruent condition, it just takes a lot longer in the reaction time to actually name the correct color. Now, what we did already a few years ago, but only published this year, we did a pretest to see if we can move this into virtual reality and if there's any stress already going on just by putting this into virtual reality. So we had 3 different conditions. We had a 2D condition where the normal Stroop test was presented. Then we had a 2D condition in virtual reality where the same happened, kind of in a 2D plane in virtual reality. And then we added a slight addition to it, so you had to move your head a little bit to focus on the Stroop item. And yeah, we didn't see much of a difference from the test going from the real world to the virtual reality. So we were sure that we can try this, and we saw that there's a slight increase in stress if you at that side condition. So there's also other implementations of the Stroop experiment in virtual reality, and also other implementations for stressors in virtual reality. I will just quickly go over them. So what's usually done, and I haven't found any other work which actually used the 3D condition for the Stroop test in virtual reality. Most of the implementations, they just do it in a 2D way, right? So just a 2D version of the Stroop test in the virtual world. That looks, for example, like something like this. So Parsons and colleagues, they created the most effective, actually, Stroop test in virtual reality, and they had kind of a combat scenario where you drive with a Humvee through a combat zone, and you get presented with Stroop items on the windshield, and you have to do that Stroop test. So, of course, they have a lot of baseline stress coming from the environment, but yeah, in general, as a stressor, it was quite effective. Now, the other thing that people do is recreate like real life stressors like the TSST just one-on-one in virtual reality, and just look whether it is similarly effective. So in this case, the image shows the TSST. On the bottom, you see the real world TSST, and at the top, the recreation in virtual reality. Now, this works quite well. It's not exactly as stressful as the real thing, but almost as stressful. And but the problem here is you have the exact same protocol, so you don't gain any time advantage or anything, but you have to do basically the same, just in virtual reality. So that's why we basically wanted to create something else. And how does this Stroop room look like? It's basically just a hexagonal shaped room with 6 walls. Each of the walls is colored in one of the Stroop colors. And you get congruent and incongruent tasks displayed in a 2D overlay. And you have to select the right wall depending on the task. And instead of naming the color, you have to basically select the color. So this is the additional task in the virtual reality, that you actually have that search task in the virtual space, and also the selection task in addition to the regular Stroop task. Now this looks like this in the implementation. So at the bottom you can see in the screen the task displayed, and below that there's a time bar. So you only have 5 seconds to actually complete that Stroop task. And if the time runs out, it's automatically like an error. Now, there are 2 different tasks that you can have. You can have the task to either select the actual word, or the task to select the color of the word. And this is basically an adaptation from the original test, because if you just have the standard Stroop test task to just always select the color, that would be really easy. You just blurrily focus on the task and match the wall to it. So this kind of creates more difficulty in the virtual reality. Now, in addition to that baseline implementation, we decided to try out some additional stressors, which might enhance the stress in this implementation. So the room 0, it's the default implementation that I just presented to you. Room A has an additional time stressor, so the time is reduced from 5 seconds at the beginning to 3 seconds at the end. You have to complete the task, and 3 seconds is basically the minimum that you can use to accomplish the task. Then in room B, we have kind of a claustrophobic additional stressor. So the walls, they are closing in on you, and at the end you have almost no space anymore left to actually select the right wall. And room C is then the increased selection difficulty. Now in this video I can show you how this actually looks in the implementation. So what you see here is the default room. We have in general 120 stimuli for the congruent and for the incongruent phase. And before those 120 stimuli, you always get 15 stimuli to just get used to the task. So this is the practice phase, where you just have to, where it actually doesn't count, basically. So this is now the room, the default implementation, and I'm not sure if you can see it very well with the Stroop task, but the person tries to select always the right wall here. Now, that's just a presentation of what happens when a time runs out. We have a flashing screen and also a sound, a buzzing sound that tells you that you were wrong. Then this is the time pressure condition. Not really that interesting, but if you watch closely, you see that the time bar at the bottom, it gives you less time each time that you do that task. Okay, for room B, you can see the walls closing in here. This is of course a time lapse, so in normal this would take like 120 stimuli to get that to the walls, get that close to you. But just for the presentation, we did it in a speed up. Okay, and then for the last condition, there's a selection difficulty, so we switch the colors each time you finish a task. The colors of the walls, they switch, and also the targeting area gets smaller and smaller, and at the very end it also shifts on the wall. We just try to make it more difficult to select to find the right color patch and to select it, and see if this has any influence on your stress level. Okay, so we evaluated this by several measures. So we took the traditional Stroop performance measures like reaction time and error rate. We recorded an ECG for heart rate and heart rate variability assessments. We collected electrodermal activity. We collected saliva samples for the cortisol and alpha amylase measurements. And we also collected some questionnaires like the perceived stress of the subjects, and also their flow, their experience flow level, and some other questionnaires where we just assessed whether they were kind of depressed, because depression has a major impact on your stress reactivity. Now we recorded a lead 1, Eindhoven lead 1, lead 2, sorry, Eindhoven lead 2 ECG, and the EDA we recorded from the fingers. This was all done with the Nexus 10 device. And we collected the data from 32 participants, 16 female, mostly students, about 23 years of age, and all with a normal BMI. Now for the procedure, the main thing you have to remember here is that at the beginning we had a resting baseline phase where we collected the baseline measures for the ECG and the EDA. We had then the congruent trial, then a resting phase of 5 minutes, and then the incongruent trial, and then again a relax phase. So we decided to not randomize the congruent and incongruent trials, because we mainly wanted to know if we can induce any cortisol or alpha amylase responses. And the cortisol response, it usually takes about 10 minutes to get the peak cortisol response. And if we would have randomized the trials, then the peak would have been in the second trial always. So we try to go for this non-randomization. Now for the results, there are a lot of them. I will go through them one by one. First I'm going to explain the ECG parameters, then the EDA parameters, and the performance parameters. So for the ECG results, we can see that we have significant increases in the heart rate. On the left you see the mean heart rate increase across all subjects and all rooms. It was highly significant for from the baseline to the congruent condition, and also significant for the baseline to the incongruent condition. Between the congruent and incongruent, there is an increase, but not statistically that relevant. Then if you look at the individual rooms on the right-hand side, you can see that all the rooms perform pretty similar, except the claustrophobic additional stressor. It induced the heart rate significantly increased heart rate change from the baseline. Now the heart rate variability parameters, they look pretty much similar as the heart rate. The top graph shows you the low frequency to high frequency ratio of the heart rate variability, and it's basically pretty much the same as the mean heart rate change, but the LFHF ratio is considered to be the most relevant for assessing the stress level in the ECG. So yeah, we took this as our main measure. Now for the Eda Parameters, we measured the skin conductance level and the number of non-specific skin conductance responses per minute. And as you can see, the skin conductance level, it increased significantly from the baseline, as we expected. And for the non-specific skin conductance responses, we see a kind of not so clear picture, but still they increased significantly. Now for the performance measures, on the left side you can see the absolute numbers for the change in number of mistakes and the change in reaction time. So the bottom one, the reaction time is given in seconds, the number of mistakes is just a number. And on the right side you see the same numbers, just plotted as the relative change between the congruent and the incongruent condition. So you can see that with the time pressure, with the additional time pressure, we can, as expected, increase the number of errors that the users make. And for the reaction time, interestingly, we expected to see a very high number in the last condition, so in the last room, in the C room, where the selection task is much more difficult. But surprisingly, that was not the case. Now for the saliva measures, at the top you see the salivary alpha amylase measures for the baseline congruent, incongruent, and the relaxed condition. And at the bottom, the cortisol measures. Now, the alpha amylase changed as expected, so it increased over the congruent and incongruent trial, and was for 2 rooms at a maximum in the incongruent trial. Now, for room C, we had a kind of a systematic error, unfortunately, in our measurements, in our procedures. So that's why that graph shows kind of that weird behavior. Now for the cortisol, where we actually tried to find some differences, we couldn't really find interesting changes. So it's kind of a random stuff there going on, which in our eyes means that there's just not enough social evaluative stress in the current implementation. Now this is the comparison to other work. I'm sorry for the wall of text at the top, but this is all the references in the graph. Now what's plotted here is the change of the heart rate, LF-HF ratio, and the reaction time compared to all the other papers. The Stroop room is at the very bottom. So yeah, we only had 3 other works where we could compare the LF-HF ratio against, and yeah, some other measures were also missing in different works. But what we can see is that yeah, all the measures are for our Stroop room pretty much more increased than in the 2D implementations, except for the change in the heart rate, which is very close to the change for the work from Parsons et al. Now for the discussion, what about the Stroop effect? We can see it in the reaction time. Basically, we don't see that clearly in the biosignals. But when you look at the blue graph, at the blue bars here, this is basically the reaction time, and it is normalized. So we already normalized for the fact that we have the selection task and not the just speaking out the word. And we still have a significant increase. So this might not be entirely the Stroop effect. It might also be the thought about where you have to move and actually doing the search in the virtual space. Now, like I said, the interesting point here is would be for us to find a difference between the stress effect between the rooms, which is significantly different for the claustrophobic additional stressor, and what happens with the actual stress effect of the Stroop effect, which would be visible in the change between the congruent and the incongruent measures during those trials, which are not really significant. So we didn't find any significant changes there. They were higher for pretty much every measure, but like I said, not statistically significant. This is the same for the heart rate variability plots. You can see that with the x, marked with the x, is the mean value. The mean value shows that it's pretty much different from the median here, and we had isolated subjects which experienced a much larger increase in the biosingle parameters than others, and I mean like 5 times or 10 times more increase. So that's why the mean is so much different from our median here. This is something that we still have to well, check out with additional recordings, because either there's something going on that we didn't capture, or people are just experiencing the Stroop room that much differently. Now, as a conclusion, I can say that the Stroop room induces a significant cognitive stress. Yeah, but we still need to understand better what the actual influence of the Stroop effect is here. And the further recordings that we do right now, we actually randomize the conditions, the incongruent and the congruent one, to find that out. And yeah, we have an inconclusive cortisol reaction, which is probably due to the fact that we don't have a social evaluative stress element in our Stroop room, which is also kind of what we want, but we hope that we might be able to find a reaction in the cortisol response. We will try to implement additional social evaluative element and see if we can affect the cortisol response. Now, we have for some measures, like I said, we have large variance or disagreement in some of the measures, and that's why we continue with the data collection. We right now have 70 additional participants collected, and we also collected 30 participants completely outside of the university setting, where we already know their stress reactivity. So that's also a next step, that we want to correlate the stress reactivity with our Stroop room results. All right, and everything we plan to publish the whole thing on GitHub, so the Stroop room, that you can also use it if you intend to do some stress tests. It's not up right now, but as soon as I get back from the conference, I will upload all the code and also all our CSV files for the results, so you can check through this yourself if you want to. And that's it. Thank you for the attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Question, okay. Coming to you.
Thank you for the great talk. Would it make any sense to compare your 3D version of the Stroop in VR with the 2D version?
What do you mean exactly?
The 2D version of Stroop task.
But we did that, right?
In VR?
Yeah, that's the next step. Oh, actually, that's a point. So we published the first paper, and it was already accepted, but not yet published. So we couldn't use our results from the previous test in this paper. So that's kind of the mess up that we couldn't solve. But yeah, that's certainly something we plan to do for the future. Yeah.
And if you compare that?
So we did a preliminary comparison, and the 3D version is definitely more stressful. But the point is that in the original test, we didn't find really much of a difference. So the 2D version outside the virtual reality and inside the virtual reality was basically exactly the same. And we only had really slight changes, and we need maybe also to record additional subjects in that configuration. Yeah, but that's basically the point.
Thanks.
More questions?
In the Stroop task, when they were spinning around to look at the colours, did they get cybersick?
No, actually not. So I think we had one subject who said that it was kind of dizzy at the end, but normally no. So absolutely no person got cyber sickness. But we already tried to exclude participants who reported to us that they would be very much susceptible to cyber sickness. So we didn't even invite them.
Cool.
Thank you for the great talk. So the other studies that were done with the Stroop test, did they also measure the cortisol levels of the participants?
Yes, one of them measured the cortisol levels, I think. They also didn't find any change. So yeah, it's kind of what we expected, since there's no social evaluative stressor, and this is basically what triggers the cortisol response. Yeah, we just wanted to make sure basically with this experiment that there really is no cortisol response, and now we can try to introduce some kind of additional stressful element that might induce the cortisol response.
Like a person that looks at you in VR.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the idea we have, that we place the experimenter inside the room, so you have really the feeling that he looks at you while you perform the test. Yeah, that's a good idea.
More questions? Okay, one more.
Thank you for the talk. So in your experiment, you have been using EDA physiological sensors and ECG,
Yes.
correct? So and the participant has to move to select the color.
Yeah.
So did you find any case where they had motion artifacts in like as a noise in the data that you have collected because of the movement and like shift in the electrodes or something like that?
Yeah, so for the ECG there wasn't a problem. We used like adhesive electrodes on the body. So there was of course some motion artifact, but not severe enough to distort our measures. For the EDA that is a big problem. That's also why we didn't consider like specific responses in the EDA, but only count the number of general responses, and also only use the general level, because we are not sure how the motion artifacts affect the EDA measure, especially because it was on a non-dominant hand and you used the controller in a dominant hand, and we kind of know that movements on the one hand affect the EDA response on the other hand. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we might have time for one more quick question. No? Okay, I have one question. Do you have any participants who memorized the room and then did not even turn the point?
Yeah. We had two people who said they play games all the time, and they were doing like not even turning around. So they really memorized it and were really, really good. So they did like one error in the whole thing. So kind of frustrating.
Okay, let's thank the speaker.